Hi, it's Anna here. Thanks for tuning in. So today I wanted to do a video on how to reconcile Earth School and the matrix overlay, and what I lovingly call the layer of bullshit on top, because it's very real that there is a lot of suffering, and I don't believe that uh, we should amalgamate contrast versus trauma and abuse. So what I want to explain is that there is a swing, right? And there are two very popular extreme views. So the first one, on one hand, is thinking that it's just an earth school, and the trauma and abuse is completely fine, and that's how we evolve, and uh, you know, justifying really trauma and abuse and suffering. And on the other extreme, you have the black pill, which is that, viewing the overlay as the whole, making the entire thing a problem, viewing the Earth as a prison planet, talking, a lot about the soul reincarnation, soul trap, all of that stuff, right? Giving evil way too much power, basically. So my view is that I stand very much firmly in the middle, and that I view Earth as a school, and I can also very much see the matrix overlay. So, knowing that Earth is a school, it's a knowing that I've had since I was a child. And if you observe, life in general, um, and putting aside abuse and trauma, right? If you observe life in general, I'm a mom of 3 kids, so I get a lot of opportunity to observe how, when things work well, there is actually so much beauty, so much power, and so much growth that happens on Earth. And the way I view it is that we can't evolve in the higher realms the way we can evolve in matter. And so personally, I don't view the fall of Adam and Eve, the fall of humanity, as a mistake. I view it as a very much necessary path of evolution, for the simple reason that you can see how you need contrast to evolve. You can evolve a lot more when there is separation, when there is limitation, when there is friction, when you bump up against um, different people who are different than you, when you have to actually bump up against boundaries, when you have to not get always what you want, when you have to, experience heartbreak, um, experience having to hurt people and having to work on your communication skills to, to become better at communicating so that you don't, hurt people. So there is like so much beauty behind the divine design. This is also where morality gets tested, right? This is where you learn through your mistakes. You're going to have to be burned sometimes to see that actually that doesn't feel good. This is not what I'm meant to be doing. And so to me, I view Earth as a testing ground, and the way we evolve into self-consciousness, into this self-awareness. Earth is the place where you get given an ego, and this individuality is actually the entire point of evolving here. Now, I make the distinction between contrast and abuse and trauma. We evolve through contrast. Abuse and trauma is an entire other kettle of fish. And this is what I view as a matrix overlay, where this goes a bit too far. Does it mean that we can't evolve through abuse and trauma? Of course you can, because you're so smart and you're so powerful that you can literally extract any gold from anything. And you should be doing that. But it doesn't actually make the abuse and trauma right. It doesn't mean that it was meant to be there. So in this sense, the way I view things is that, people on the Eastern path, they talk about the Kali Yugas, and that yeah, we are at a point on Earth now where it is the Kali Yuga, which is actually a reflection of where we are in the cosmos, where we are further in separation from feeling this union with God. We are, in a denser place. But I don't view it as justifying why there is so much evil, trauma, and abuse. This is on humanity. It didn't have to be that way. Let me just put it that way. What I've learned through my life and through healing from narcissistic abuse is that, yes, I've evolved so much, but I've had to fight my way out of it. And it didn't actually necessarily have to be that way. I can extract the gold that I need and I can evolve myself out of it. But, my dad trying to kill me was not a necessity. Let's just put it that way. So what I want to do actually to emphasize what I'm saying is I want to read a passage from a book by Rudolf Steiner. And that book is called The Christ Impulse and the Development of Ego Consciousness. In case you are similar to me and in case you need this specific key, this passage from this book was the key that I needed for me to reconcile this knowing that I have that Earth is a school and there is so much beauty and so much perfection behind the design of actually how we evolve through contrast, and reconciling it with the fact that there is currently so much evil, so much abuse and trauma that is actually creating so much havoc in people that it's making them devolve, it's making them not evolve actually. And very often you have to bring yourself through healing back to base level, right? Before you can even rise. So it's not as if you're starting as at the base level. Very often with what you've gone through childhood, you're actually going through, starting from minus. So I just wanted to share this book with you because I actually have never come across anyone who's shared this view from Rudolf Steiner. And specifically for me, that was a key that I needed. So I tend to have a stronger French accent when I read. So feel free to pause this video and just read what's on screen if that's easier for you to comprehend. And this is specifically referring to the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible. Then human beings became autonomous in their decision-making through the Luciferic influence. That is, they became beings which developed divine characteristics within themselves at too early a stage. Thus, something entered human nature through the Luciferic influence, which would otherwise have been preserved for human development until the middle of the Atlantean period. Now you can imagine that human beings would have been quite different if such a descent into matter had not been given to them until the middle of the Atlantean period, because then their souls would have been affected by that descent when they were more mature. They would have arrived in matter as better, more mature human beings. They would therefore have introduced different characteristics into the physical, etheric, and astral entities, and would have acquired quite a different capability for deciding between good and evil. Because human beings turned themselves into decision makers about good and evil from the Lemurian time to the middle of the Atlantean period, this meant that they made themselves worse than they would otherwise have been, and therefore arrived in a less perfect state. They would otherwise have undergone the whole period to the middle of the Atlantean period in a much more spiritual way, but in this way they passed through it much more materially. But this had the effect that if human beings had not additionally been given what the gods intended them to have in the middle of the Atlantean period, they would have fallen completely. What would have been given to human beings in the middle of the Atlantean period if until then they had been instinctively guided and led by divine spiritual beings? They would have been given what they, once the Luciferic influence was there, were given through the mystery of Golgotha. The Christ impulse would have been given to them in the middle of the Atlantean period. But now, because the Luciferic impulse was there, they had to wait as long for the Christ impulse as the time from the Luciferic influence to the middle of the Atlantean period. As much earlier as Lucifer sought out human beings before the middle of the Atlantean period, as much later the Christ impulse came. Thus, we have to note a delay of the Christ impulse, because human beings acquired their godlikeness earlier than should have happened. Because human beings had first to undergo all the things that accrued to them in earthly karma as a result of the bad things that entered them through the Luciferic influence. This first had to be suffered, as it were, by humanity. Human beings had to wait not just until the Luciferic influence had made them a decision maker between good and evil, but also until everything had happened in the course of Earth development that had to come as a result of the Luciferic influence. They had to wait for that. Only then could the Christ impulse descend to Earth. The divine cosmic guidance did not intend human beings to go without what they obtained through the Luciferic influence for eternity, but they were to receive it in the middle of the Atlantean period. They were to receive it at all events. But in other circumstances, they would not have received it in the form that they did through the Luciferic influence. Through Lucifer, human beings have not just received free decision-making powers regarding everything connected with spiritual things, they also received the faculty to develop a passion for what is good and noble, wise and great. In the way that we are as people today, we cannot just decide in a cold and sober way about good and evil, but we can also become passionate about what is beautiful, what is noble, good and wise. That is because something was introduced into our astral body, which would otherwise, had it only been added in the middle of the Atlantean period, have been introduced into the I, into the judgment-making I. So everything that we have by way of feelings, of idealism, of passion for the good, for high ideals, we owe to the circumstance that something entered our astral body before we obtain godlikeness in our I, the acceptance of Christ in our I. That is the key thing. That is godlikeness, this equality with God, this possibility of finding the good within ourselves was to be imparted to human beings. If the Luciferic influence had not come, this impulse would have come in the middle of the Atlantean period. But thus, it came in the time in which Jesus Christ was at work. So the consciousness entered human beings through the Christ impulse, that they have something of divine substance and being in their I. This is what underlies all the deeper sayings also in the New Testament, that human beings can take the divine into their I, and that this divine aspect can work in it and make a decision between good and evil. We can therefore say that with the acceptance of the Christ impulse into the inner human beings obtain the possibility of saying to themselves, I am my own guide regarding insight into my existence, regarding decisions about good and evil. When we now look back to pre-Christian times, we have to say, since the impulse which makes human beings the real deciders between good and evil did not exist at the time, the decision between good and evil, the judgment and knowledge of goodness, beauty and truth, was of necessity incomplete in the pre-Christian period, and one which could not actually arise from the innermost nature of human beings. Before the arrival of the Christ impulse, human beings did not have the possibility to make a decision about good and evil from out of their innermost being. A decision on true goodness, on real truth, on real beauty, could only be made in pre-Christian periods, because single individualities such as the bodhisattvas reached up into the divine worlds with this part of their being over the course of time. In other words, did not fetch the decision about good and evil from the innermost part of human nature, but from the divine worlds. They obtained it through their interaction with the divine spiritual beings, and then instilled it into the human soul like a suggestion. Without such guides, humanity in pre-Christian times would only ever have made defective decisions about good and evil. If these guides had relied on their own heart, they would not have managed it either. They received the impulses which human beings needed to be able to implant goodness in a preparatory way into the earth, nevertheless, in times of flawed decisions about good and evil, and only because they descended into depths of the soul which were not yet available to human beings, because they left the being of their own I to enter the realms of heaven. Thus, human beings in pre-Christian times were beings who had obtained godlikeness for characteristics which had not yet sufficiently matured. for something which was not yet at all suitable to be godlike. As a result, human beings have done everything since Lemurian times more badly, more inadequately than they would otherwise have done. Above all, the Luciferic influence in the pre-Christian period meant that they did everything more badly and inadequately, which relates to themselves. Because of the way that things transpired, the astral, etheric, and physical bodies developed in a worse and more material way. They would have remained more spiritual had it not been for the Luciferic influence. As a result, all the bad things which developed over time also entered human life. They developed over a long period of time. Bad things developed in the physical body, etheric body, and astral body from Lemurian times to the mystery of Golgotha. High-grade egoism developed in the astral body. The possibility of making errors when we want to judge something developed in the etheric body, and the possibility of lying. If human beings had remained under the influence of divine spiritual beings, had acted instinctively in accordance with their impulses, then today, when they wanted to obtain knowledge about their surroundings, they could neither have fallen prey to error nor been seduced into telling lies. But in this way, the inclination to tell lies and the danger of error entered human development. And because the spiritual always causes the physical, and because the Luciferic influence and its consequences have eaten deeper and deeper into the etheric body from one incarnation to the next, the possibility of illness entered the physical body. Illness is the bad thing in the physical body which came through this development. But something even more important came. If human beings had not succumbed to these influences, if they had not let them act on them, then the awareness would also not have arrived that in the moment when the physical body falls away from us, anything happens other than a transformation of life. The awareness of death would not have arrived. Because if human beings had descended less deeply into matter and had retained the threads which link them with the divine spiritual, they would have known that when casting off their physical mantle, it merely meant the start of a different form of existence. They would not have looked at it as the loss, the end of an existence to which they had become attached. So all things in development would have had a different face. Because human beings descended deeper into matter, they made themselves freer and more independent, but they also made their development more flawed than it would have otherwise have been. All the things which became flawed in human beings are healed again through the Christ impulse. Now, we should not demand that they be healed in a significantly shorter period than they were caused, or even in a very short time. The time from the Lemurian epoch to the mystery of Golgotha is a very long one. And slowly and gradually, acting from incarnation to incarnation, came egoism, error and lies, illness, and the feeling of death. Because the Christ impulse is at work in humanity, these characteristics are transformed back in an ascending development. We might say that human beings are being guided back into the spiritual world with these characteristics which they obtained down below. It will even happen faster than the descent happened. But we should not demand that through what they can assimilate through the Christ impulse, human beings will be capable in one or two incarnations of overcoming their selfishness, of healing themselves in their etheric body to such an extent that the danger of lies and error no longer existed, or that they could act in a health-giving way right down into their physical body. That has to happen slowly and gradually, but it is happening. Just as human beings were led in their descent to all the characteristics we have described through the Luciferic influence, in the same way they will be led upwards again through the Christ impulse. Selfishness will be transformed into selflessness, lies into truthfulness, the danger of error into assuredness and true judgment. Illness will become the substratum for all the greater health. All the illnesses we have overcome will become the seeds of a higher health. And when death is gradually understood in such a way that the death on Golgotha acts as the model of death in our own souls, then death will have lost its sting. Human beings will know why from time to time they have to discard their physical mantle in order to penetrate ever higher in the course of their incarnations. But what the Christ impulse has specifically made possible is that the impetus has been given to make good something that concerns human knowledge and human observation in particular, the knowledge of human beings about the world. We have said that human beings became more enmeshed in matter. made themselves more deficient in their three bodies than would have been the case if no Luciferic influence had come, that allowed an impetus to take hold of human beings, which made them descend ever deeper into material existence, to hurtle with ever greater thoroughness into mere matter. That happened in particular with human knowledge, but it also happened slowly and gradually. Human beings did not sink down immediately so deeply after the Luciferic influence took hold that all the gates to the spiritual world were locked behind them. Human beings long remained in contact with the spiritual world, which they had grown out of and in which they would have stayed with their whole being if the Luciferic influence had not come. Human beings for a long time still shared in this spiritual world, felt for a long time how the threads of the divine spiritual world led into their finer spiritual instincts. They still acted for a long time in such a way that the impulse was not merely a human one, but one as if the gods were behind it. That was particularly the case in the oldest times. Human beings were only gradually thrust into matter, and with that they also lost their awareness of the divine. The spiritual streams and world conceptions in humanity which had a knowledge of these things therefore always indicated that there was a time in which, although human beings had already been thrust a little way down into material existence through the Luciferic influence, they had not been thrust down so far that this divine influence was not strongly active in them. This age was called the Golden Age in ancient times of human development. That is not some product of the imagination, but the expression Golden Age is simply an expression which those followers used who in ancient times still had an idea that there was once something like an original period of human development, as has just been described. This Golden Age, which is described with the term of Oriental philosophy as Krita Yuga, has proportionately lasted longest of all the ages, which we will go on to characterize. This Golden Age was followed by the so-called Silver Age. Here, human beings had already been thrust further down into the physical world, but everything happened slowly and gradually. The gates to the spiritual world had not been closed yet completely either. Human beings still had strong moments in which they still noticed the gods driving their instincts in dreamlike clairvoyance. Although human beings could no longer be called the companions of the gods in this Silver Age, they did still notice that God stood behind them. This age is called the Treta Yuga in Oriental philosophy. Then there comes an age which extends into our post-Atlantean age. Its last spurs extend into historical times in which there were still people gifted with ancient dreamlike, hazy clairvoyance. But the consciousness of the spiritual world, which human beings had grown out of now, only existed as a kind of memory that had remained from ancient incarnations. It was like as if you think of your youth, your childhood, and your present age. In our childhood, we directly experienced our childhood experiences. Similarly, the human beings in the Tetra Yuga still directly experienced the impulses of the divine spiritual world. In the age which then followed, which is also called the Bronze Age, only something like a memory of it remained. We could compare it with the way that an adult looks at his childhood. Because you will say, I experienced my childhood, it is not a dream. That is what it was like in the Third Age. Human beings knew. We experienced the connection with the divine in earlier times, but now it is no longer present except as a memory. I have shown in detail how a memory of the Atlantean time remained in ancient Indian culture. So I'm going to stop here. It keeps going and, explaining that we did fall into the Kali Yuga. It keeps going. So I thought this was just so helpful and fascinating to map things out and to reconcile what I've experienced and what I'm observing very with a lot of clarity. And the fact that, there's a lot of immaturity that we see everywhere. And, it can't just be explained by people not wanting to do their work, right? Like there's just so much suffering as a result of that immaturity that I don't think it's fair to say that. I don't think it's fair to say that it's just humans not doing their job, right? And so that's why the story of Adam and Eve is so relevant and important for us to understand. But I think some people, we're living at a stage of complete spiritual ignorance and I would say retardation, where we can read some text and completely misunderstand it because we don't have the context. And so that's why I feel like this book in particular gave me a lot of context, because some people will view what Lucifer did, the serpent in that story, as a gift to humanity, and then they will say, well, he's the good guy. He's the one who liberated us. And so that's where the nugget of truth is there, but then it gets twisted. Because yes, we were actually always meant to become self-aware. There's no problem there. When I read the story of Adam and Eve, I can see that. I've always felt like, okay, the self-awareness component is organic. It's a gift to us, and that was always the aim of God in this creation. But the problem is that we were tricked into falling way too early. And you can view the Lemurian time of consciousness as, like infancy. Like if you compare it with the way us human beings evolve through our life in terms of our awareness, you can compare that with infants. You don't give fire to infants to play with. There's a maturity process that needs to happen, and a stewardship that needs to happen, and there's a place and time for things to happen and evolve organically. You don't force things. And so that's the problem. Things were forced. We opened ourselves up to good and evil way too early, to all these influences way too early. We were tricked into it. And so now it's a process. It's been a process ever since of restoring this, of, still going through Earth School and the very organic process of evolution, despite this inherited wound, if you will. So obviously, we also have a lot of responsibility. We bear a lot of responsibility. We do have free will. But I think that level of awareness is important, so you understand like what you're dealing with, and so you can validate the feeling that you have that abuse and trauma is not for our evolution. This is what's happened because, people were way too immature and they haven't evolved. You can tell. Some of us were born into families where we are actually a lot more evolved, a lot more mature as souls as our own parents. So we are at a time where some of us are ready and willing to awaken. We've been given this gift of awakening, of being able to actually see the world exactly as it is, and people exactly as they are, and things exactly as they are, which means confronting evil, seeing evil and confronting evil, which is very difficult. This is actually a very difficult path, and it requires a lot of inner strength and taking our time through it. It's a process. Actually, the path of pretending that there is no good and evil, this false path of enlightenment, what a lot of people call false light, is easy in comparison. It's easy to put the rose-colored glasses on and pretend that it's not there. It's a lot harder to see things as they are and to be able to hold that within yourself and to do the work of fortifying yourself and healing until you're able to hold it without losing your center. And so because we are in this task of doing this, and we are doing it, there can be a tendency to be shocked, right? Like, I mean, I understand it because seeing evil in the relationships that I've been in and the world has been very difficult. When I had my awakening in 2021, I cried for 4 weeks straight, and then I grieved for 2 years. And so that's what it takes, right? It's not just a simple, oh yeah, I'm awakened, and like we're just partying and it's all good, guys, it's just a game. Doing it the right way takes a lot of strength. And so we need to also reconcile ourselves, or reconcile seeing and confronting evil without completely rejecting the idea of Earth as a school, and without completely rejecting the fact that there is a divine design, there is an organic design, there is a divine guidance that is good and loving and pure. And I feel that this excerpt from Rudolf Steiner in this book was the key that I needed. And so I'm sharing it today because I haven't come across anyone else sharing that, despite watching a lot of um, content on Rudolf Steiner online. So yeah, this is what I wanted to share, and I would love to hear in the comments if if it's something that actually you find useful as well. So thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye for now.